When Margaret Wilson pushed open the door of that weathered cabin in March 1982, she expected a routine welfare check. She'd been a social worker long enough to know what poverty looked like. Underfed children, worn-out clothes, maybe a house falling apart around them. But almost immediately, she sensed this was different. The first thing she noticed was the smell, damp wood, stale air, and the faint sweetness of decay, like leaves left too long in the rain. The walls were darkened by smoke from years of wood-burning fires, and the only light came through cracks in the wooden boards. It felt less like a home and more like a world sealed off from time. Elijah Shelton stood firm in the center of it all, his arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that felt like both challenge and warning. He wasn't hostile, not exactly, but his presence made it clear. You were on his land, and you followed his rules. At his side was Martha, his younger sister. She barely spoke, keeping her eyes lowered, moving only when Elijah prompted her. There was something unsettling in her silence, not shyness, not rudeness, but the quiet of someone who had learned that speaking brought more pain than relief. Then came the children. Thomas, the eldest, hovered near the doorway. His arms were thin, his skin pale, but his eyes were sharp, almost watchful. Suddy clung close to Martha, tilting her head ever so slightly, a strabismus, a lazy eye, pulling her gaze. And Jacob, just 5 years old, toddled forward with wide, curious eyes, his words halting, his movements behind those of a child his age. Margaret did her job carefully. She noted the basics: mild malnutrition, untreated medical issues, no sign of schooling. But she also noticed the way Jacob clung to Martha's skirt, the way Martha's hand instinctively stroked his hair, the bond that felt deeper than an aunt and. In a place as vast and secluded as the Ozark Hills, neighbors might live miles apart, but news or suspicion travels in curious ways. For years, the Shelton family had been little more than a rumor whispered in general stores or church parking lots. People spoke of them in hushed tones, as if the Hills themselves demanded discretion. Sarah Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Sheltons, remembered them all too well. She had been friends with Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's mother, back before the tragic fire of 1973 that claimed both parents. After that fire, Sarah tried to keep in touch, bringing supplies and checking in. But with each visit, Elijah grew more hostile. He'd glare at me like I was trespassing on sacred ground, she later recalled. On one occasion, when Sarah noticed Martha's swelling belly, she dared to ask about it. Elijah's response was swift. He ordered her off the property and told her never to return. I should have done something then, Sarah confessed years later. But who would have believed me? Around here, folks mind their own. And the system. Well, the system wasn't built for places like this. Then there was Reverend Samuel Miller, a traveling pastor who made his way through the backroads of Missouri during the late 60s and early 70s. In his journals, discovered decades later, he described the Shelton homestead as a place heavy with silence. He wrote of Martha's submissive posture, of Elijah's paranoia, of a sense that something was off, without being able to name it. In 1971, Miller even noted seeing Martha visibly pregnant, only to be turned away by an enraged Elijah. When he reported his concerns to the local sheriff, the reply was chillingly dismissive. Without hard evidence, nothing could be done. Even in town, whispers circulated. The clerk at the supply store in Current River remembered Elijah coming in with the children once or twice. What struck him wasn't just their malnourished appearance, but how eerily alike they looked to Elijah himself. It was like looking at copies of the man, he said. But suspicion is not proof, and in small towns, suspicion alone rarely leads to intervention. For years, these quiet warnings, Sarah's observations, the Reverend's notes, the clerk's unease, hung in the background like pieces of a puzzle nobody wanted to assemble. They were stories too strange to confront, easier to dismiss than investigate. And so, the Shelton family remained hidden, their secrets protected not only by isolation, but by the silence of a community unwilling or unable to pry too deeply. It wasn't until Margaret Wilson arrived in 1982 that all these fragments began to converge. The neighbors' whispers, once scattered and ignored, now formed a chorus, one that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. The Sheltons hadn't just chosen isolation. They had built a world within those hills where rules were rewritten and where secrets, no matter how disturbing, could survive for generations. For months, Martha Shelton had been little more than a shadow in the background of the investigation. She rarely spoke, never contradicted Elijah, and seemed to exist only in the margins of her own life. But everything changed during Jacob's hospitalization. Away from the cabin, away from Elijah's watchful eyes, Martha began to soften. At first it was small gestures, sitting closer to Jacob's bed, speaking more freely with nurses, allowing herself moments of visible worry. For the first time, Margaret Wilson saw her not as the silent aunt, but as a mother. One evening, when Jacob lay asleep under the haze of medication, Martha finally opened up. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, as though the walls themselves might betray her. She spoke of the years after the fire that killed their parents. Elijah had stepped into the role of patriarch, repeating the same warnings their father had drilled into them. The world outside was corrupt, untrustworthy, dangerous. "We only had each other," Martha said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "He told me no one else would understand, that we'd be torn apart if anyone found out." It wasn't a full confession, not yet. But in her trembling words, Margaret heard the truth that documents and DNA had already revealed. Martha hadn't chosen this path. She had been drawn into it, step by step, by Elijah's control and the crushing isolation of their world. Psychologists later described her condition as coercive control, a slow, suffocating manipulation that strips away a person's ability to resist. For Martha, the boundaries between sister, partner, and victim blurred until they no longer existed. Her story carried echoes of fear and guilt. She admitted how often she thought of running, of taking the children, and leaving the hills behind. But where would she go? She had no money, no friends beyond the woods, no sense of the world outside. The very idea of leaving felt as impossible as stepping off the edge of a cliff. Margaret didn't press for more. She knew that trust, once broken, would never return. Instead, she simply listened, offering the one thing Martha had never been given, a safe space where her voice mattered. Over time, Martha's quiet disclosures painted a portrait of life inside the Shelton cabin. Elijah's growing paranoia, his insistence on secrecy, the way he preached about pure blood and keeping the family intact. To him, it wasn't a crime. It was a twisted kind of doctrine, one he believed would protect them. For Martha, though, it was a prison. And as the truth began spilling from her lips, it became clear that the real story of the Shelton family wasn't just about isolation or even incest. It was about control, fear, and the breaking of a woman's silence after years of being forced to live in it. The Shelton children were the heart of Margaret Wilson's concern. From the moment she stepped inside that dimly lit cabin, her eyes were drawn not to Elijah or Martha, but to the three young faces that seemed both innocent and haunted all at once. Thomas, the eldest at 12, was thin but wiry, with sharp features that mirrored Elijah's almost exactly. His right arm bore a deep scar. Later, Margaret learned it came from an accident with an axe, untreated except for a strip of cloth. Thomas carried himself with a quiet toughness, the kind you see in children forced to grow up too fast. Yet behind his guarded expression, there was a flicker of something else, a hunger to understand the world beyond the cabin walls. Suddy, 9 years old, was different. Her eyes didn't quite line up, one drifted slightly, giving her gaze an unfocused quality. It wasn't uncommon, just a case of untreated strabismus, but it meant she had likely struggled to read or even see clearly. Still, she clung fiercely to her mother, or who she thought was her aunt, Martha. Every time Margaret asked a question, Suddy pressed closer against Martha's skirt, as if hiding inside her shadow. Then there was Jacob, only 5, but already showing signs that worried Margaret deeply. His speech was slow, his coordination clumsy, his comprehension behind where it should have been. He didn't just look like his siblings. He looked like a smaller, Frileo copy, stamped with the same blue eyes, the same jawline, as if individuality itself had been stripped away. What unsettled Margaret most wasn't only the children's health or appearance, it was the uncanny sameness between them and the adults. The bone structure, the ears, even the way their eyes tilted. These weren't just family resemblances. They were reflections. And reflections, Margaret knew, told their own kind of story. In her report, she wrote about malnutrition and lack of schooling. But privately, she noted something she dared not yet put in writing. These children bore the unmistakable signs of close kinship, too close to ignore. The children themselves seemed to sense the strangeness of their world. When Margaret tried simple conversation, asking Thomas what he liked to do, or if Suddy had friends, the answers were clipped, hesitant. Thomas muttered about helping with wood. Suddy said nothing. And Jacob simply stared. It was as if the concept of friends or school was foreign to them. On the drive back, Margaret's heart sank. She'd seen poor children before. She'd seen neglected children before. But she'd never seen children who looked like this. Children who seemed like echoes of a secret. It was then she realized the real story wasn't the poverty. It wasn't the isolation. It was the children themselves. And if their faces were telling the truth, then the Shelton family was hiding something far more disturbing than anyone wanted to believe. For months, suspicion swirled around the Shelton family like smoke. The whispers of neighbors, the missing records, the strange resemblance among the children. It all pointed in one direction. But suspicion alone couldn't shatter Elijah's defenses. To move forward, investigators needed something undeniable. Something that could not be argued away. That's where science entered the story. When 5-year-old Jacob fell ill with a severe respiratory infection in September 1982, Margaret Wilson seized the opportunity. She convinced Elijah to let the boy be taken to a hospital in West Plains. It was a rare moment where necessity overpowered Elijah's resistance, and it gave doctors their first real chance to examine one of the Shelton children outside the walls of that cabin. Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist, was called in. His team noticed anomalies that, on their own, might not raise alarms, but together, they painted a troubling picture. Jacob's skull showed subtle malformations, his fingers were fused in a way consistent with Apert syndrome, and his developmental delays were more severe than previously thought. These weren't random misfortunes. They were hallmarks of close consanguinity, children born from parents who were far more than distant relatives. The findings aligned with what Margaret had observed but hadn't been able to prove. Now there was medical evidence. And Jacob wasn't the only one. Thomas, the eldest, had polydactyly, an extra finger that had been crudely removed. Suddy's dental problems went beyond neglect, suggesting genetic roots. Together, the children displayed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Dr. Brennan explained it plainly. These are not the outcomes of chance. The genetic markers here are typical of offspring from very close blood relations, closer than cousins. It was the kind of statement that left no room for misunderstanding. Still, in order to confirm the truth beyond any doubt, DNA testing was necessary. But the law required judicial approval, and the courts hesitated. Incest was a crime, yes, but proving it meant prying into the most private recesses of family life. Elijah, meanwhile, fought fiercely against any intrusion, repeating his mantra, "We take care of our own." For weeks, the investigation stalled in legal wrangling. But as Jacob's condition worsened, doctors obtained limited judicial authorization. Tests were performed quietly, almost in secrecy, while Elijah remained under watchful supervision. When the results came back in November 1982, they shattered any remaining illusion. The DNA showed, beyond question, that Elijah was the father of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob. And Martha, the silent, withdrawn woman who had stood in the corner of that cabin, was their biological mother. The science was clear. The whispers were true. And now there was no turning back. When the court reached its verdict, the question of Elijah's punishment was only part of the story. The greater challenge lay ahead. What would become of Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob? For children who had known nothing but the confines of a cabin and the rules of their father, stepping into the outside world would mean starting life almost from zero. They were placed in foster care in a neighboring county. For the first time, they experienced things most children took for granted: classrooms, playgrounds, doctors who asked gentle questions, and lights that turned on with the flip of a switch. These simple things were as foreign to them as another language. Thomas, the eldest, adapted the fastest. At 12, he carried the resilience of someone who had always been forced to shoulder responsibility. School was difficult at first, but within months he caught up, surprising teachers with his determination. That scar on his arm, once a reminder of hardship, became a story of survival he would carry with quiet pride. Suddy's journey was slower. Her strabismus made reading hard, and socially, she struggled to connect with children her own age. But with medical treatment and corrective lenses, her world began to sharpen, literally and figuratively. Art became her refuge. Teachers noticed her drawings, vibrant and strange, as if she were trying to express a world that had been locked inside her for years. Jacob faced the steepest climb. His Apert syndrome required surgeries to correct his skull and hands. His developmental delays meant he would need lifelong support. Yet, even in his struggles, Jacob found joy in small victories, learning to form clearer words, riding a tricycle, discovering music. He was slower, yes, but he was present, and that presence was something his caretakers described as radiant. All three children began to shed the shadows of their past, though the scars, physical and emotional, never fully disappeared. For Thomas, the burden of responsibility would always weigh heavier than for most boys his age. For Suddy, memories of fear lingered in her drawings. For Jacob, surgeries and therapies became part of his normal life. But together, they were no longer trapped. They had choices, opportunities, and, most importantly, a future. Martha, too, was part of this rebuilding. Though considered a victim rather than a perpetrator, the court required her to undergo therapy before she could regain custody. With state assistance, she eventually moved into a modest house near West Plains. There, she worked toward her GED, found a job as a library assistant, and slowly rebuilt her identity outside Elijah's shadow. Over time, the family found a rhythm. The children grew in ways no one had thought possible, carving out lives that proved resilience can emerge even from the darkest circumstances. And though the scars of their past would always be with them, they were no longer defined by it. For the first time in their lives, Thomas, Suddy, and Jacob were free to imagine something that had never existed inside the cabin walls, a future of their own. By early 1983, the Shelton case was no longer just a hidden family tragedy, it was a matter for the courts. In the small Shannon County Courthouse, reporters gathered, locals whispered, and officials braced themselves for one of the most difficult trials in the region's history. At the center of it all sat Elijah Shelton. His gray beard and piercing eyes gave him the look of a man carved out of the hills themselves. He didn't deny who he was or where he came from, but he resisted the label society had stamped on him: criminal. To Elijah, he had simply followed the path his father had set before him: mistrust the outside world, keep family bonds above all else, and never let outsiders dictate the rules. His defense attorney leaned hard on that idea. Elijah, he argued, was a product of generations of isolation. Raised by parents who were themselves cousins, kept away from schools and communities, Elijah had never been taught the boundaries the rest of society took for granted. Could a man truly be guilty, the lawyer asked, if he had been shaped by a world so cut off from the norm? But the prosecution told a different story. They painted Elijah not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who had knowingly hidden the truth. He had gone into town to buy supplies. He had seen how other families lived. He knew enough to lie about a wife who never existed. And most damning of all, he had silenced Martha, keeping her under his control while fathering 3 children with her. Martha's testimony was perhaps the most powerful moment of the trial. Behind closed doors, shielded from the public, She described the years of manipulation and fear. "He told me we were special," she said. "That our blood was pure. That no one else could be trusted." Her words were hesitant, heavy with shame, but they revealed a clear pattern. Elijah hadn't just fallen into this life. He had created it and forced her to live within it. Experts were brought in to explain the psychological effects of extreme isolation. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist, told the jury that when people are cut off for years, even decades, their sense of right and wrong can warp beyond recognition. "Isolation builds its own reality," he said. "And inside that reality, things that seem unthinkable to us can begin to feel normal." The jury wrestled with the contradictions. Was Elijah a predator, or a man shaped by generations of dysfunction? Was Martha a partner, or a victim? In the end, the verdict walked a difficult line. Elijah was found guilty of incest, a crime in Missouri punishable by up to 4 years in prison, but the jury recommended leniency, citing the extraordinary circumstances of his upbringing. When the judge handed down a 3-year sentence with the possibility of early release, the room felt divided. For some, it was justice. For others, it was nowhere near enough. But one truth was undeniable. The silence of the hills had finally been broken, and the story of the Shelton family was now forever part of the public record. The Ozark Mountains are a place of contradictions. To an outsider, they seem almost timeless, a land of rolling hills, deep forests, and rivers that cut through valleys like veins of glass. But behind the postcard beauty lies something else, an environment that has shaped people through hardship, resilience, and, in some cases, dangerous isolation. For generations, families in these hills survived by keeping to themselves. Roads were poor, winters harsh, and neighbors scarce. In communities like Shannon County, Missouri, self-reliance wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. You grew your own food, drew water from your own well, and trusted only the people under your roof. Outsiders? They were rarely welcomed, often treated with suspicion. But there's a fine line between independence and isolation. And in the case of the Shelton family, that line had blurred so completely that the outside world almost forgot they existed. Their cabin sat nearly 30 kilometers from the nearest town, connected by nothing more than a dirt road that washed out every spring. No electricity, no running water, just a vegetable garden, a barn, and the same wooden structure that had been built by Elijah Shelton's grandfather in the 1920s. For decades, the Shelton family lived here, largely unseen. To most in town, they were just another reclusive clan in the Ozarks, not unusual, not particularly alarming. But in March of 1982, that all changed. At first, it was just a complaint. Someone anonymously told the Missouri Department of Social Services that children were living in unhealthy conditions at the Shelton property. In rural counties, such rumors weren't uncommon. But when caseworker Margaret Wilson made the long trek up that muddy road, she stepped into something far more complex than malnutrition or poverty. She found a family cut off from reality itself. Elijah Shelton, a stern man in his late 40s, greeted her with piercing blue eyes that seemed to carry generations of mistrust. At his side was his younger sister, Martha, quiet and withdrawn. And then came the children, Thomas, 12, Suddy, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years old. At first glance, their struggles seemed typical of poverty. Malnutrition, lack of medical care, a scar left untreated, a lazy I never corrected, a boy who seemed behind in his development. But Margaret couldn't shake a feeling. The children weren't just similar in the way siblings often are. They looked too similar. Same bone structure, same striking blue eyes, same ears, same mouths. It was as if they were mirrors of one another. Something wasn't right. And as Margaret left that cabin, walking back down that lonely dirt road, she knew the hills had revealed more than just poverty. They had whispered the beginning of a secret that would grow into one of the most disturbing cases Missouri had ever seen. Margaret Wilson's instincts told her that something was terribly wrong at the Shelton cabin, but instincts alone weren't enough. To uncover the truth, she needed facts, hard evidence that could stand against Elijah's silence and Martha's quiet obedience. And so, She turned to the only place that couldn't lie: the records. Her first stop was the Shannon County Courthouse. In the musty archives, clerks pulled out old birth and marriage certificates, faded papers that carried the stories of families across generations. When Margaret asked about Elijah's supposed wife, the answer was immediate. There was no record, no marriage license, no obituary, nothing to suggest another woman had ever lived with him. But there were documents on Elijah and Martha themselves, both born to Harold and Edith Shelton. And here came the first unsettling detail: Harold and Edith had shared the same last name before marriage. Later, historians would confirm they were first cousins, a fact not unusual in isolated communities of the Ozarks. But to Margaret, it felt like the beginning of a pattern, one that ran deeper than a single generation. The next trail led to hospitals in neighboring counties. Old files revealed a curious pattern: a woman, sometimes under different names, treated for pregnancies in 1970, 1973, and 1977. Each time, the physical description matched Martha Shelton. Each time, the outcome was the same: a child was born, then disappeared from official records. No birth certificates. No adoption filings. Just nothing. The years lined up almost too perfectly. 1970, Thomas's age. 1973, Suddy's. 1977, Jacob's. It was as if the children existed only in flesh and bone, but never on paper. Margaret's suspicions deepened. If Martha was indeed their mother, then who was the father? The answer, though unspoken, hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. But paper records could only say so much. Margaret needed voices, people who had seen, suspected, or remembered. And soon, those voices began to surface. Neighbors, though distant, recalled glimpses of the Sheltons. A woman named Sarah Jenkins, now in her 80s, stepped forward, recalling how she had once seen Martha visibly pregnant in the early 70s, only to be pushed away by Elijah when she asked questions. And an old traveling pastor, Reverend Miller, had kept diaries noting his unease about the siblings' relationship years before. Each fragment painted a picture that grew darker with every brushstroke. The more Margaret searched, the more the official silence of the state collided with the whispered suspicions of locals. The conclusion was becoming harder to ignore. These children weren't born of poverty alone. They were born of a family secret that the hills of the Ozarks had hidden for far too long. And the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. The truth wasn't locked away in the cabin. It was written in bloodlines. By the time Elijah Shelton walked out of prison in 1985, the world had already changed, and so had the way Missouri looked at families living on the fringes of society. The Shelton case wasn't just another crime tucked away in court records. It had become a turning point, a stark reminder of what could happen when isolation and neglect went unchecked for too long. Lawmakers responded quickly. In 1985, Missouri passed what became informally known as the Shelton Law. It required social services to conduct routine checks on families living in remote areas, even if no formal complaints had been filed. For decades, children in rural cabins had slipped through the cracks, invisible to the very systems meant to protect them. After the Shelton case, invisibility was no longer an excuse. In academic circles, the case became a study in extremes. Sociology classes dissected how isolation can warp family roles. Law schools debated the balance between respecting privacy and protecting children. Medical schools used it as a grim example of how genetics and endogamy can leave lasting marks on generations. But the legacy wasn't just in policy or academia. It lived on in the lives of those directly affected. Thomas, the boy with the scar and the sharp eyes, grew into a man who dedicated himself to helping children like him. He became a social worker, turning the weight of his past into fuel for a career in advocacy. "I wanted to be the person we needed back then," he once said in an interview. Suddy, whose childhood drawings carried the echoes of fear, pursued a quieter path. She became an artist, her work reflecting both the darkness she had endured and the beauty she had fought to find. Her pieces, sold in small galleries, often depicted cabins, forests, and figures half hidden in shadows. For her, Art wasn't just expression, it was healing. Jacob, the youngest, faced the steepest challenges. Multiple surgeries, therapies, and lifelong medical needs shaped his adulthood. But with the support of his community, he carved out a semi-independent life. He became an advocate for people with disabilities in rural areas, using his own story to shine a light on struggles too often ignored. And then there was Martha. Once a silent figure in the corner of a cabin, she reclaimed her voice. She raised her children with the support of the community, rebuilt her education, and found work that gave her a sense of pride. Though the past never left her, she refused to let it define the rest of her life. Looking back decades later, Margaret Wilson, the social worker who first set foot on that muddy road, reflected on the case. "What shocks me most," she said, "is how something so extreme could happen just miles from town, in plain sight, and no one stopped it sooner. It makes you wonder how many other stories like this remain hidden." The Shelton cabin has long since collapsed, its timbers rotting back into the earth. But its story endures, a haunting reminder of how isolation can twist into tragedy and how breaking silence, no matter how late, can change the course of generations.